Joining us now on the line from London, UK, Philip Lawn, director of the policy think tank Res Publica and author of Red Tory, How Left and Right Have Broken Britain and How We Can Fix It. Philip, it's good of you to join us on the line. How are you tonight?
Very well. Great pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much for being with us. In what ways, let's just start very generally, since you place the blame on left and right, in what ways do you believe Britain is broken?
Well, I think you have sort of a broken model on the left and a broken model on the right. On the left, the idea that the state was the sole proxy for human good and all we needed was a bigger state with more money and more financing and would solve poverty, would save the poor from their lot and would introduce well-being and prosperity for all, has clearly failed during New Labour, during Tony Blair's administration. We pumped more money than ever into public services, and yet the condition of those at the bottom of society got worse, inequality widened, and in some ways we started to reintroduce class and even caste barriers to human progress. And I think on the right, what the right has long argued is actually it can deliver prosperity for all through holding back the state and letting free markets rip. And I am pro-market and I believe in a free market, but actually under the guise of free markets, we've produced oligopoly, in some cases monopoly, and we've closed off markets while using the language of creating free ones. And actually what's happened is wealth hasn't trickled downwards, it's trickled upwards. And the right has created essentially a new elite and a new forms of serfdom, where people own less and less and find it more and more difficult to enter markets. And the only thing that they used to own a lot of, housing, created an asset bubble that's burst and converted wealth into actual debt and liability. So really, I think we're at a step change, just as we were after the Second World War, just as we were in the late 1970s, early 80s. And the step change is unique, I think, because both of the old models have failed. And I think we're at the beginnings of having to radically rethink what conservatism means and think what a new model of capitalism means, creating a popular form of capitalism that genuinely creates wealth and prosperity for all. And a new model of the state, a state that doesn't tax us so heavily and delivers far more effective and efficient outcomes. All of this means I think it's a very exciting time to be a political thinker because it actually enables us to move beyond the errors of the past, but build on our traditions and create something genuinely new.
Everything is relative, of course, and I want to get your sense about whether or not Britain is any more broken than, say, Germany is, or the United States is, or France is. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it depends on which models you choose. The OECD, for instance, did a survey where they compared social mobility, which is how free your society is and how children from poorer backgrounds can progress. And the societies that were the most immobile, where there was the highest correlation between parental income and the income of children, first was the United Kingdom, second was Italy, and third was the United States. And actually, in time after time, when you compare US and UK statistics to OECD statistics, actually the Anglo-Saxon world does worse in that regard, in terms of creating ever more impoverishment at the bottom, widening the rungs on the ladder of aspiration and progress for people. And it seems to me in certain ways we're recreating the conditions of serfdom in both Britain and America. And in that sense, if you actually want to get ahead, it's better to be born in France or Germany than it is in America or in the United Kingdom. And that's a terrible indictment of our politics and our society, especially when we've had 30, 40 years of the rhetoric of entrepreneurship and ownership. The reality is very different.
Let me read something that David Cameron said before he became Prime Minister. He said this back in March before the UK general election. And this is what got you, in some respects, blazing onto the screen. Some people say that there are no big ideas left in politics, but I don't agree. I think this is about as big as it gets. It's not the big state that is going to tackle our social problems and increase our well-being. It's the big society. And we know we have to use the state to help remake our society. You know, for those over here on this side of the pond who aren't as aware of it, would you describe what you think the big pillars are that hold up the big society that you refer to?
Well, I think the big society thesis is telling an old truth that many of us recognize, that all of our wealth, all of our well-being, all of our health comes from actually human relationships and our relationships between each other. And if we lose that, we create a form of capitalism that only works for very, very few people, and we create a state that actually only works for very, very few people. So the big society is attempting to have a critique of both the state, but also a market that in some sense has become increasingly monopolized. So the idea of the big society is essentially the old left and the old right have squeezed out the world of ordinary people, squeezed out the small businessman, the entrepreneur, the family, the community that wants to make a difference. It's squeezed out the citizen from society so that people in developed economies, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, find it more and more difficult to change even the small things around them, let alone the big things. And so it's about putting the citizen in the driving seat and re-empowering communities so you create the right sort of society and the right sort of economy, and breaks with centralization, standardization, big government, and a world where you create a form of crony capitalism that actually shuts out the little guy and everybody else in between.
How much do you think the idea's caught on?
Well, the very fact we're discussing it tells you, doesn't it? I mean, we've been discussing it endlessly in Britain ever since the idea was first mooted. The Labour Party, which is the left-wing party in Britain, now accepts actually it should have adopted a variant of it. And across the political spectrum, whether left or right, everyone's claiming the big society for their own and giving it their own spin. And in some ways, because it was so new, and you might argue in many ways it wasn't communicated successfully, it sort of lost every battle, but I suspect it will actually win the war. And I think there's a huge amount of international interest in the big society because everybody knows the problems that we're facing as we, from demographic change to technological change, means we need to change the relationship between people and the state and people and the economy. In America, for instance, Occupy Wall Street is right about a certain form of capitalism, but the Tea Party are also right about a certain form of the state. And a big society encompasses both critiques and tries to create a form of capitalism that works for everyone and a state that doesn't legislate against its citizens but creates the conditions for citizens to legislate amongst themselves.
We're just about to broaden our discussion and invite some others to join us and consider conservatism today. But before we do that, I want to ask you one more question, and that is, Margaret Thatcher clearly was a conservative. I think you self-identify as a conservative, but I'm not sure you two have all that much in common. How can you both be conservatives?
Well, I think Mrs. Thatcher was in a number of ways a liberal rather than a conservative. And as a liberal, much of what she argued for actually conspired against what she believed in as a conservative. But Mrs. Thatcher, I think, is a powerful, albeit a mixed legacy, because in some ways, many of the things she argued for threaten the structures of family, of community, of human relationships, of marriage, all the things I support as a conservative. And the form of capitalism she created, which again I support, has actually tended to become a form of oligopoly or monopoly just for big players. So I think that Mrs. Thatcher created a settlement that wasn't continued. And over time, it's decayed into something that in many ways is not, I would argue, truly conservative.
Okay, let's continue that conversation and find out who the quote-unquote real conservatives are. So, joining us now in Washington, D.C., David Frum, editor of the Frum Forum and author of Comeback, Conservatism That Can Win Again. And with us here in studio, Jonathan Kay, comment pages editor of the National Post, David Warren, columnist with the Ottawa Citizen, and Jerry Nichols, conservative commentator and the author of Loyal to the Core, Stephen Harper, Me, and the NCC. Great to have you three here in our studio again. And David, so nice to have you on the program today. We had your wife on last week, David. She did a great job for us.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let's put you to work right away and ask you whether you think in order to be a genuine conservative, David Frum, you have to bemoan a loss of the past.
Well, I like to focus on the problems of today, which are extremely acute, more acute maybe in the United States and in Britain than they are in Canada. When I think about this question, here's how I think about it. The conservatism I grew up with and that I championed through the 70s and 80s was a response to the problems of that time. inflation, stagnation, the loss of the competition, or the seeming threat of loss of the competition with the Soviet Union, breakdown of public order, especially in American cities. And the conservative public policies of those days really did successfully address those problems. Inflation is gone. We had an extraordinary run of economic growth with low unemployment. The Cold War is behind us. And American cities were restabilized and public authority restored. They are now unrecognizable compared to the cities of the 1970s and 1980s. Those are all huge successes, and the people who are responsible for those successes deserve enormous credit. But the nature of politics is constant change. You solve one problem, a new problem comes down the assembly line, and you have to be adequate to respond to the new problems. One of the things I worry about in conservative politics is people just want to take endless encore performances and once again and again receive applause for attempting to solve completely different problems with tools that successfully solved prior problems.
And that doesn't work for you, obviously.
Well, as I said, I think politics is a matter of addressing present problems. And today's problems in the United States, to a lesser extent in Canada, this huge global depression, the risk of losing in the modern economy 70–80% of your population to perpetual economic stagnation, the widening of class divisions, the alienation of people from politics. These are the things that I think are most pressing right now. And of course, looming all of that, the question of whether Western democracies in general can keep first place over a great economic competitor, China, that is imbued with very different values that it would make, if it were in charge, a world I don't think any of us want to live in.
David Warren, though, when you say the word conservative, it seems implicit in the word that you want to conserve something that has come before it. Isn't that necessarily so?
A perpetual encore kind of guy. Part of the problem here is simply with nomenclature, that we had, to begin with, socialists, liberals, and conservatives. The socialists are now called liberals, the conservatives are, the liberals are now called conservatives, and the conservatives are now called social conservatives and demonized accordingly. I'm one of that last class.
You don't get demonized here too much, though.
Not here. This is the only place I can go to be safe. No, the interesting background question here is, are we discussing only an economy or a civilization at large? There's no question economic questions are real. But in the conservative view of the world, as it came down in the age before Reagan and Thatcher and so forth, and incidentally, I agree with Philip that Margaret Thatcher was essentially a liberal, and in that part of his politics that were effective, Ronald Reagan was essentially liberal too. I also agree with David Frum that they were solving problems of their day. But the perennial problem is trying to establish on a vast centralized scale, as we've been doing in each of these countries for many years now and throughout the West, what amounts essentially to municipal government. That is, trying to regulate lives in a cradle-to-grave, nanny-state sort of way, that very large centralized authorities are not equipped to deal with. And in the course of it, creating immense, viciously Kafkaesque, frequently, bureaucracies, which create unintended consequences at each point, and indeed generate many of the second-order problems that another generation of conservatism has to deal with.
Let me get John Kay to play with this question a little bit. Do you pine for the past? You're a conservative.
I do pine for the past.
You do?
Yeah.
What parts of it?
Well, 20 minutes ago, it's interesting, actually, about the definition of conservatism, because if you go back to Edmund Burke's time, conservatism really was about the past. It was about preserving the virtues before the French Revolution, the agricultural identity, religion, family, what we would call social conservatism today. What happened, and that's still, to a certain extent, the definition of conservatism in continental Europe. What happened in North America is what we call conservatism got attached to capitalism. And so these days, if someone's a free market purist, you call them a conservative. But the reason that the definition doesn't make sense is capitalism is about creative destruction. And Thatcher is a great example. If you break up the coal mining syndicates in northern England, if you break the unions, well, we call that conservative because it's about the free market, but you're destroying a way of life. You're forcing millions of people to get new jobs.
Which is not conservative.
It's not conservative at all, because and you see this all the time in America. You know, conservatives are the ones who, in many cases, they destroy families through denying them universal health care. They force people to get new jobs. Now, there's a lot of good that comes out of it. You know, America's economy regenerates itself and reinvents itself every generation. But the result is that, you know, old homes get torn down in favor of McMansions. People who once had great jobs when they're in their 30s, suddenly they're in their 50s, they're working at Walmart. So conservatism, as it's practiced in North America, the popular idiom of what we call conservative, in many ways is radically non-conservative. And it destroys the fabric of society in many cases, which is actually one of the reasons I find it so interesting. You know, I work at the National Post. People call Terry Corcoran, you know, free market guy who runs the Financial Post, reads Ayn Rand and all that stuff. They call him a conservative. He's not a conservative. I call these people free market cultists because they believe the free market can solve any problem. You can believe that if you want, but don't call yourself conservative because it's about creative destruction. It's not about conserving the past.
Jerry, where are you on that?
Well, I think what we call the conservative movement is really just a group of disparate tribes that really don't have a lot in common with each other. You know, you have your libertarians. I would consider myself a free market cultist, I suppose. Your social conservatives, you have your red Tories, you have your populists, you have your neocons, you have your foreign policy hawks, all broadly speaking are conservatives, yet they don't really like each other all that much. I mean, Philip's idea, you know, I would never go for that. You know, it's the policy of the 3 Ps, paternalism, pessimism, and pining for the past. Maybe that's 4. But I don't really go for that kind of, I believe in free markets, I believe in individualism, I believe in smaller government, I believe in maximum freedom for individuals, I believe in free trade. The reason we are a conservative movement at all, I suppose, is because, you know, we may not agree on anything. I think it'd be hard for everybody in this panel to come up with an agenda that we all agree to, but we probably could all hate the same things. And that's generally how a conservative coalition is put together. We all hate something. And, you know, in Ronald Reagan's day, we all hated communism. We all hated the commies. So Reagan put together a coalition of all these different tribes, all these different kinds of conservatism, because they all had a common enemy.
So if you know your enemy, it's a big, big
If you have a common enemy, it's good to put together a conservative coalition. The worst thing that ever happened to conservatism was when the Soviet Union fell.
Can I jump in for 30 seconds?
Sure.
Because going back, I agree with you. When you were opposed to Soviet communism, you could reconcile the two definitions of conservatism, because protecting American society, protecting Western society, meant protecting the virtues of the free market. So protecting the past, sort of our capitalist past, and defending ourselves from the Soviet Union, defending the free market, it was all the same ball of wax, right? Which is why Thatcher, Reagan, we remember them in such romantic ways, because that was an era when conservatism was more unified.
We were also younger then.
Communism is atheist. It's communist against tradition. It's against the free market system. It's against anything broadly
Don't
conservative.
forget godless atheism.
Yeah.
Godless
I want to
atheism,
give Philip Blond a chance to respond to your 3 or 4 Ps. We're not quite sure how many there were. Since you referenced him, we should give him equal time here. Go ahead, Philip.
No, I view myself as neither paternalist, pessimistic, and I forget the other 2 Ps. I actually think that much of the contemporary problems we face, and I agree with David on this is where the real issues actually come from, both collectivism and individualism. And actually, we've created a market that doesn't work for people because essentially it's founded on an extreme form of individualism that means only some people win and everybody else loses. But when you create a market model that does that, you create demands for the state and you need state welfare. And actually, this kind of unholy alliance between collectivism and individualism is what has produced, indeed, what we see in America, sort of fewer and fewer people actually getting a proper return from wages, more and more of them turning to the state and to welfarism, welfarism creeping up the economic ladder, so it's now a middle-class phenomenon, and creating an economy that doesn't work. So this isn't about the past, this is about a radical break with a past that has failed. And actually it's very hopeful and futural and very, very modern, actually, what we're arguing for in Britain. And actually I think it will become the politics of the future, because it's about creating a society of owners who can trade, who can access markets, who use social capital to create finance capital and create a type of productive economic exchange that can actually further marriage, further the family, further human relationships, and indeed, as one of the panelist was talking about, further civilization itself, because that is the true aim. And I think the real enemies of this are the old enemies of both libertarianism and collectivism, and they are not something any proper conservative should endorse.
David Frum, can I get you to follow up on that?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to understand here that Britain, Canada, and the United States are in many ways on very different tracks. If you are a person living in Britain, one of the things you have to confront is that your cities are much more disorderly. Your public life is much harsher. There's more crime than there used to be. On a lot of those metrics, Britain is getting worse and worse and worse. Murder rates are still much lower in Britain than in the United States because they don't have so many guns about. But other crimes are as bad or worse, and the trend line is negative. In the United States, despite the terrible economy, actually public order is getting better. Crime is a receding issue in the United States. In Britain, there is a very intrusive, highly centralized state. In America, we're looking, I think, much more at a failure of the state, an omission of the state, a failure to exert proper financial regulation that could have prevented a very, very preventable financial crisis. It's not just there is a general problem with the wages that American workers have. That's been true for a long time before 2008. But as the country is now plunged in economic crisis, what is going on now is a special kind of trauma. And in this trauma, I think conservatives do have both a special role to play, but also special challenges. For American conservatives, one of the things that is very galling right now is this terrible crisis happened in the longest period of Republican domination of the federal government. The presidency, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. Conservatives held those for almost 6 years and held them together, something they had not done since the 1920s for such a long period of time. And the results have not been very satisfactory. I joke the past decade started with Pearl Harbor, ended with the Great Crash and the Depression, with Vietnam in between. It was a very difficult time. And conservatives are in a position where this is their record. This is their past. And in order to, what inhibits them from problem solving, which is what the country needs from them, is above all a priority of blame avoidance. And so this is created, and I think this is maybe the single biggest problem with modern conservatism in the United States, an inability to look at facts. We're having an enormous debate right now in the United States, in the think tank world, about what is happening to wages. Well, one reason that the debate is so fierce is not because the debate is so difficult, but because the debate is so embarrassing. And people don't want to look at embarrassing numbers and come up with a market-oriented solution to them. It's because then you would have to do self-examination, and nobody wants to do that. Instead, what we have is a denial of realities, not just on the Depression, not just on incomes, but on a range of other issues as well, and that takes you out of the game of having useful solutions to answer. And then you become a protest movement, not a governing movement. I see myself as a conservative who likes to win elections, wants to see my friends exercise political power in responsible ways, which means you need good answers.
You did use the word embarrassing, and I want to pick up on that, if only to set up this clip that I'm about to show. This is from one of the recent Republican presidential candidate debates. And lots of people were talking about this when this happened. We're going to roll the tape, then come back and talk. Michael, if you would, roll tape.
Let me ask you this hypothetical question. A healthy 30-year-old young man has a good job, makes a good living, but decides, you know what, I'm not going to spend $200 or $300 a month for health insurance because I'm healthy, I don't need it. But, you know, something terrible happens, all of a sudden he needs it. Who's going to pay for if he goes into a coma, for example? Who pays for that?
In a society that you accept welfareism and socialism, he expects the government to take care of it.
What do you want?
But what he should do is whatever he wants to do and assume responsibility for himself. My advice to him would have a major medical policy, but not before.
But he doesn't have that. He doesn't have it, and he needs intensive care for 6 months. Who pays?
That's what freedom is all about, taking your own risk. This whole idea that you have to prepare and take care of everybody.
But Congressman, are you saying the society should just let him die?
No.
Okay, you heard it at the end there. You're saying we should just let him die, and there were screams from the audience, yes. David, let's go around on this one. David Warren, to you first. How would you classify the conservatism of the people who were willing to allow that individual, hypothetical albeit, to die because they didn't have the foresight to buy health insurance?
We're not playing with all the cards here. In a traditional conservative view of the world, we don't just have the state. We had church and state. Within the ambit of church and society generally, we had the family, we had extended family relations and so forth. The nanny state has replaced that. What is much more alarming to me, even than the material consequences of that, is the state has taken upon itself a monopoly of virtue in addition to a monopoly of force. The combination of these two things in the same centralized power, interpreted, as I say, through vast, often vicious Kafkaesque bureaucracies, with all of the vested interests that are acquired by them, creates a circumstance in which there is only one option. Either the state will pick up your bills or you will die on the street. That's exactly what was being presented to Mr. Paul, and Mr. Paul was answering in the same terms in which the question was asked. If it comes, I don't think the question can be answered in simple yes or no terms. Elements of civilization, such as charity, mercy, and so forth, do not belong to the state. There are other players involved.
Philip Long, what was your reaction to that clip?
Well, I tend to agree with exactly the comments just made, that actually they express both sides of the same problem. If you create a society where you have to, in some sense, have perfect knowledge of your future, which is a left-wing utopian view, and if you somehow then make a decision about that and it goes wrong for you and then you're on your own, it's the wrong worldview. It's not a conservative worldview. I think it's a profoundly left-wing and radical view. And so I think we've got to escape from the idea that the only carrier of the public good is the state. And we've got to create lots more intermediate positions. And I agree with the thought. We've got to include the church, faith, family relations, community. And if we sort of have a richer mix, then we wouldn't even be in that problem. A society that poses the problems in that way is already in trouble. A society that asks that question and answers it is not a society that has a notion of the common good. And a society that doesn't have the notion of a common good is a society divided against itself. And indeed, in some sense, what's disastrous for America, and I want there to be a strong America, because unless you have a strong America, the West cannot succeed, is Americans no longer have a way of articulating things they hold in common. So they become fractured into a sort of oppositional tribes and polarities, which paralyzes the state and means people are essentially abandoned to themselves, but they can't even work with others. So you disempower and you harm the country, you harm its military reach and its cultural reach. And I think no true conservative, no true American conservative could support that, and indeed no conservative could support that for any country whatsoever.
David Frum, your reaction to that quote?
Well, I think Ron Paul got himself backed into an absurd position because of his absurd set of ideas. First, it needs to be, Canadians need to understand, if an American goes into a coma in a hospital, that American will be cared for and the state will pay for it. The great gap in the American healthcare system is not that the state refuses to pay the $300,000 to save the person in the coma, is that it refuses to pay the $30 for the preventive test that could have saved that person from having to spend the $300,000 in the first place. So that's problem one. The second thing that I think Ron Paul needed to pay more attention to is the reason why so many young people decline to pay the $300 a month for health insurance is why in the world does health insurance cost, actually $300 a month would be a pretty good price. Why does it cost so much? Why does it have to do that? What has gone wrong with the way health delivery is organized in the United States that Americans spend twice as much of national income as just about anybody else for health care and get worse results? I think then there's the next question, which is another reason that that young person might hesitate to spend so much, is because the young person's out of work. And in the United States, for very historic but irrational reasons, the past isn't always good. Health insurance is connected to jobs. It shouldn't be. And one of the things that Mitt Romney tried to do in Massachusetts was to find a way to deliver health insurance in a way independent of jobs, but people would then see the bill, and that's encountered tremendous resistance. The desire to speak in these kinds of broad ideological categories that has been such a feature of Republican politics this year is not an indispensable preliminary to intelligent problem solving. It's really been the opposite. And I think the reason the audience was cheering was not because They were heartless people, although some of them may have been. They were cheering because they just loved that ideological clarity. And they loved also Ron Paul's pose of speaking difficult truths to a hostile media. But of course, they're not truths, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. And the real missing piece of the Republican Party are people who really do know what they're talking about and have some solution to offer that is not comprehensive national universal health insurance financed through taxes.
Let's acknowledge, John Kay, that it was a false choice in the way Wolf Blitzer asked the question, and we have introduced into evidence all of what David Frum just had to say. You're a conservative. Were you? The audience was obviously overwhelmingly conservative. It was a Republican presidential nominees debate, after all. Any of that reaction make you uncomfortable?
It makes me very uncomfortable. These are people who are out of touch. You have a highly polarized environment in the United States where the people are traumatized by everything from terrorism to economic crash to the rise of China. And people who live in traumatized times tend to embrace simple cultish solutions. And on the Republican right wing, that means, as I said, free market dogmatism, that the solution to every problem is lower taxes and a smaller state. I find it interesting that conservatives have this romantic idea that we just have to get back to sort of charities and the family, taking care of people, as if the local church has an MRI machine in it or something like that. Look, a century ago, when these were the solutions to problems, healthcare was like 1% of the American GDP. Now it's something like 15%. The reason is increasing technologies, expensive drugs, the increasingly difficult nature of modern medicine. The hospital used to be a place you'd go, you'd send grandpa, he'd spend 6 weeks there, then he'd die. You'd had palliative care. Modern medicine didn't exist, so it was possible to fund healthcare through local church groups. That world doesn't exist anymore. You live in a world where it takes 20 people to do even basic operations. And conservatives have no answer to that kind of world. They just sort of catchphrases. Sorry, go ahead.
Philip, you wanted in, and then I want to hear from Jerry on this.
Yeah, actually, I think that's the wrong way round, because most of the problems in current healthcare are chronic, not acute. And actually, we have a system that's set up entirely acute. And actually, what we need to do is manage chronic long-term conditions, the conditions that come with old age, with loneliness. And actually, those problems, which are the real drivers of cost, can only be met by the sort of solutions that I'm talking about. New social and society solutions, where people learn to care for one another in a way that actually hugely helps everybody involved, both the people doing the caring and the people cared for. And actually, that is the future of 21st century medicine.
Jerry?
Well, that reaction we saw in that clip offended me, not as a conservative, but as a communications professional. There's a reason why you don't answer hypothetical questions. And I think more broadly than that, I think one of the problems conservatives have in terms of libertarians, whatever you want to call them, in communicating is they put the cart before the horse. They'll go there and say, we need lower taxes, we need smaller government, we need to slash the size of government, all this kind of stuff. And people don't know really what you're talking about, or that might scare them. Well, you're going to take away our education and our health care. What conservatives have to do is they have to explain why high taxes are wrong, why socialized health care is bad, why big government is bad, why individual freedom matters. And once you make that case, then you can talk about here's why we need lower taxes, here's why we need smaller government, here's why socialized health care isn't necessarily the answer to all our problems. We need some new ideas, we need some alternatives, we need more of a free market approach.
But as a libertarian, were you embarrassed by the reaction of that crowd?
Well, as a libertarian, I only take pride or embarrassment in my own actions, not in the actions of others.
All right, David.
I think one point that has to be made here fairly clearly. The debate is contaminated by slandering the past in many ways. I want to take issue particularly with one thing that Jonathan said here. What I would invite almost anyone to do is to look at a large-scale map of the middle of any Western city, America or Europe, from 100 or more than 100 years ago. Large enough scale that you can see what the buildings are. And you will find that an even larger proportion of the middle of the city is taken over by what used to be called eleemosynary institutions, all of them private in nature. The notion that when somebody got sick in the past, they either died promptly or else they took them down to the river and shot them, is wrong. Now, this is important because the approach that is taken, I think, by all political classes, because as we saw in the Ron Paul clip, we have the same assumptions being taken whether from one side or the other, is that we're proposing solutions that are in their nature egalitarian. At the risk of offending all of the not really conservative sensibilities, I don't think that this comes into it. You have complicated organic solutions to things which existed in a variety of different societies in the past, which were erased by centralized political egalitarianism. How do you recover it? Because everybody knows that you can't go towards the past. It's by gradually removing the artificial methods that are used to create this large bureaucratic and egalitarian function over society, which is why, in fact, the two ends of conservatism are joined in some sense simply in my terms, I would say, trying to destroy as much of the government as we possibly can.
Well, let me follow up on that with David Frum then, because you wrote, one of your books was about the Ronald Reagan years, and I know that many Republicans are fond of quoting Ronald Reagan's speech in 1981, his first inaugural, when he said, quote, "Government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem." But not many people remember that that sentence actually started with the words, "in this present crisis." And I wonder whether that requires a reevaluation of what Ronald Reagan actually stood for as a conservative, meaning that he wasn't opposed to effective government. Is that fair to say?
Well, we can discuss the biography of Ronald Reagan, and he had a lot of complicated ideas. But I think you put your finger on with that phrase something that is important here. I think almost all, my guess is all of us in the panel are born within 5 years of one another. When Jerry talks about the problem, freedom being the solution to problems, that is something that is very powerful to those of us who were born between 1952 and 1963 or 4, because when we came of age, we confronted a whole series of problems to which more freedom really was the answer. Why are there oil shortages? Answer: oil price controls. Decontrol oil, the shortage goes away. Why is there inflation? Well, because government is managing the money supply incompetently and is trying to use monetary policy to do things that monetary policy shouldn't do. We had in those days, rent controls in cities were a real problem. We had until the middle 1970s, almost all of the American transportation system was regulated. Important parts of banking, they regulated the interest that could be paid on a checking account. And so the experience of those of us, we didn't do it, our elders did, but we watched as young and impressionable people, as one after another, these various regulations left over from the First World War, the Second World War, the Depression, or the years of hyper-confidence and statism after World War II were dismantled, and with positive results every time. The question that you have to encounter as you move into your middle years and you talk to young people who then confront the problems of your time is, if you talk to a 21-year-old today and ask them to list the most important problems they face, how many of the problems they face are driven by a lack of personal freedom? It's not because of a lack of personal freedom that young people find it more difficult to marry and have lasting arrangements, lasting attachments. It's not because of a lack of personal freedom that right now they find it difficult in the United States to find meaningful work commensurate with their education. It's not because of a lack of freedom, except in a very remote sense, that hypothetical about the person in the coma comes up. We have different problems. Some of them, as in the healthcare case, highly technical and administrative. Others having to do with the need to have a new generation of economic solutions. Others having to do with the kinds of things that David Warren and Philip Blond are especially interested in, which is that there is something that has gone wrong in people's ability to form intimate attachments as compared to previous times, and those are powerful sources of fulfillment. But the answers of 1978 are only going to be valid for the problems of 1978. And if fate sends us new problems and we keep offering the answers of 1978, why, we're just going to sound like tiresome old people.
Let me go to John Kay on this one, because I think you surprised a number of people with a recent review that you wrote for the National Post on Linda McQuaig and Neil Brooks's book about rising inequality in Canada, and you agreed with, you're a good conservative, but you agreed with a lot of what they had to say. And I wonder whether you could talk about how rising inequality is, seems to be as much a problem for people on the conservative side of the barricade as it is for people on the liberal side.
Sure,
of it.
although I'm going to dispel a myth here. I'm not a good conservative at all, as I think my performance tonight has demonstrated.
Well, you're still writing for the National Post.
I am,
so.
yeah. I'm a very naughty conservative.
And they're not very good conservative either.
Yeah, so we'll do another show on that. Look, Capitalism only works when you have lots and lots of middle-class people who can buy the products of a capitalist economy. If you have school teachers and firemen and policemen and ordinary bank tellers and people who work in cafeterias who can't buy a house, who can't afford to buy things, who can't afford medical care, who can't afford to send their children to college, then capitalism for those people has failed. And people have to review that. The biggest problem facing our society, maybe not Canadian society yet, 10 years from now, maybe that'll be the case, American society is wealth inequality. It's as bad now as it was in the 1920s, and the reason it's bad is that if you have people who are too poor to buy things, and you have people who are extraordinarily rich and spend a very small percentage of their income on buying things, and then you have a very small number of people in the middle, you have this sort of hourglass economy, capitalism is going to fail. It doesn't matter how much you love capitalism. It doesn't matter how much you love freedom. It doesn't matter how much you love Paul Ryan or Ron Paul. You can say all these things and go to Tea Party events, but if middle-class people can't buy stuff because median wages have been frozen for 30 years, capitalism is going to fail. So if you love capitalism, if you love freedom, if you love all those things, you have to put yourself in FDR mode and say, how do I save this? And unfortunately, there is no free market solution right now to income inequality. There is no free market solution right now to many of the problems that the United States in particular is facing, and I think David Frum did a very good job of elucidating that.
There will never be a free market solution to problems of inequality or whatever. And I want to reiterate the point I made before, that taking egalitarianism as the end of political action is taking for granted the creation of the nanny state, because nothing else is going to prevail
no one is taking that for
against
granted.
nature.
I'm not taking egalitarianism for granted. What I'm taking for granted is
That's
creating,
going to be, no,
creating
I
a functional,
understand your point, that this is
society.
going to be the political pressure which is arising, whether we like it or not. But here we must go back to the question of civilization and its ethics and so forth. Are we to have a society which is based on envy, which is outrage because I haven't got the equal to somebody else? Or are we going to have a society multifaceted morally in its nature, which attaches itself to a great range of virtues? It is in the nature of egalitarianism to be the banyan tree of the Buddhist ethic. You can have that, or you can have everything else. Which would you prefer?
Let me get Philip Blond on this. Do conservatives, in your view, see a free market solution to the income inequality that we've just been talking about over the past few minutes?
Well, I think there is a free market solution to income inequality, and that is to have a free market. But what we've actually produced under the guise of the free market is a rentier state, is where actually certain corporations, certain very wealthy entities have captured markets and have erected barriers to market entry for new people, so there's no way to get ahead. I mean, I tend to agree with the analysis here. What we've done, if you go back and read Hayek's Road to Serfdom, he argued for a form of capitalism where capitalism was plural, where we dispersed wealth, equity and innovation, so there were multiple sources of power in a society. What's the type of capitalism we've got now? It's massively concentrated in very few corporations and very, very few in terms of percentage of the population. If you look, for instance, from 1984 to 2006, the percentage of Americans who had zero net wealth or minus wealth has risen from 11% to 20%, fully 1/5. So what we've done is we've created a new servile class. And interestingly, the form of free market economics we've practiced haven't been free markets at all. They've been about creating new forms of oligopoly and monopoly. And what we have to do is two things. We have to break up the monopolies and the oligopolies. We have to create new structures of ownership, particularly for people at the bottom. It can't just be residential housing, because actually if you take housing out of wealth, American wealth, the median value for American wealth fell by 10% since 1984. So we've got to create new centres of wealth and new forms of ownership. And more importantly, we've got to get the state out of the way, because the state creates regulatory barriers to market entry. And there's a double conspiracy against mass prosperity. The conspiracy of the right that has used the language of free markets but produced kind of Loctite monopolies, and the left which says, okay, we'll regulate them. But the trouble with regulation is it favours incumbency. So unless we break this unholy cartel, we're not going to create an open, free and prosperous society where capital disperses power and wealth. And if we don't have that, we will have not just inequality, but new forms of serfdom. And I think we're already there for certain people.
Jerry, let me bring you in to talk. I was downtown this morning at King and whatever it was, King and Jarvis, and the tents are still there.
Right.
The tents are still there. The the 99% are still in the tents. And I don't say that facetiously, because it's interesting. I saw some figures recently which said if you're part of the 1% in the United States, you're making north of $400,000 a year. In Canada, it's $160,000 a year. So again, as we talk about income inequality here, do you think, as a good libertarian conservative, that the biggest winners in our societies ought to pay more for the privilege of living in a society that has allowed them to do so well?
Well, clearly not. That's Marxism.
I'm asking the question.
Just to go back to some of the discussion here, I don't believe this way to save capitalism is to destroy capitalism. I don't believe in, there's a middle ground between free markets and socialism, which some conservatives like to talk about. I believe that free markets are the best way to help the economy, to create prosperity. Certainly throughout history, free markets have been the greatest creators of wealth that we've ever seen.
Would you agree we haven't had that lately?
Well, I think we haven't had that lately to the degree of government regulations and government interference and high taxes and all kinds of other bad government things. But I think it goes beyond just economics. I mean, the reason why I consider myself a conservative libertarian is because it's consistent with the idea of personal individual freedom. Mm-hmm. Capitalism is the only economic system which really allows personal economic or individual freedom, and I think that's what we should be striving for. And David's right. I'm sure the average person isn't saying, oh, my personal freedoms are being infringed upon. I want to bring, Ayn Rand-style capitalism. Most people are not ideological. They're not libertarians. They're not socialists. They really don't follow the news all that carefully at all. But they do have values.
Just to contrast the conservatisms here, I think the free market can take care of itself. I'm basically not interested in those guys. I have every confidence that a businessman, if he is competent, can see a market and adapt to it, all this kind of thing. I don't even think we have to worry about those people. And indeed, the most free enterprise I get is over Hayek's proposition that if a businessman is producing something which is just intrinsically evil, then we should have a law against it. But that's about the limit of the regulation. So what I'm saying is, from opposite directions, we more or less come to the same conclusion.
Well, my goal would be at least to have people think about government power and regulations. And every time the government does something, they ask themselves, what's the cost here? What's the cost of my personal freedom?
I don't think costing and statistics, or put this the other way around, I think they're terribly overblown. I could go on and on about the worldview that you generate when you're working from statistics. The interesting thing is, for a person living, for instance, in the neighborhood I live in, where a couple of murders were committed recently, we finally got some police attention, but we didn't get foot patrols. And you spoke to the police about the actual problems there. Do you know what they told me and everybody else? Go down to City Hall and lobby for more police funding. That is what democracy is about today. Now, I'm not under the illusion that it's any different when I'm paying my telephone bill. I have no clout whatever. The kind of regulatory limitation that I should love to see on business is that which comes from a decentralized order in which the large corporation or the large public service or whatever has got to adapt itself to tiny little jurisdictions from place to place, and therefore to the people who have power there.
I'm jumping in here because we're literally down to our last few minutes, and I want to hear from David Frum and Philip Blond on this question. What is the appeal, David Frum, to you first, what is the appeal of conservatism to voters today?
Conservatism will appeal to voters by offering better solutions to the problems they're most urgently concerned about, the global economic crisis, and then how you build a prosperous order after. Inequality, for example, when we talk about that, we end up blurring together three very different things. One is the widening of the distance between the richest person and the poorest person in society. That's one issue. The other is the fact that the people who are at the middle have not seen their incomes rise. Between 1947 and 1973, if you were at the middle and you stood on that spot, you got approximately twice as well off over those 2 decades. In recent years, that has not happened. And the third thing is something unique to Canada, Britain, and Australia, and the United States, different from the continent of Europe. The poverty seems to be hardening at the bottom. The poorest 20% are having more trouble escaping from poverty than they do in the continent of Europe, which is a product of both the breakdown of our educational systems and the kind of immigration policies we run, which intensify the concentration of poverty. Conservatism it's a democracy. It's a competition. Conservatism is effective to the degree that it solves real problems that real people have. Not that, that your ideas come in because that's how you find what you think is going to work. But what the customers want are results.
Last minute and a half to you, Philip Blond. What is the appeal of conservatism to voters today?
It's both social and economic. Socially, it's about the things that actually bind people together, that make people happy, that actually create the conditions for human flourishing. That's family, that's marriage, that's place, that's locality, and that's human relationship. And conservatism, understood as social conservation, is, I think, profoundly radical. It's the progressive future. In terms of capitalism, it has to be a break with the form of libertarian capitalism that we follow, that actually, in the name of the many, only benefits the few. We've got to break open the monopolies and the oligopolies and create new forms of ownership, new ways to actually, so that people aren't just reliant on wages, but have shares in businesses and other assets as well. And unless we can create a form of economic appeal, so people can advance both themselves and their families and their communities, then conservatism will create an unpopular form of capitalism. And if capitalism becomes unpopular, it will create the demands for the state. And if we create the demands for the state, we'll never, ever get out of welfarism and the destruction and the erosion of the West.
I want to thank you 5 conservatives for coming on TVO tonight from various points along the continuum. Even a bad conservative like you, John Kay. It was nice to have you here too. Philip Blond, author of Red Tory, How Left and Right Have Broken Britain and How We Can Fix It. Very good to have you on the line from London, UK, Philip. Thanks so much. David Frum, also to you, the editor of the FrumForum.com. We like watching you on CNN these days as well. David, thank you so much for being on the program. And here in our studio in Toronto, Jerry Nichols, the communications consultant, Jonathan Kay, the opinion page editor of the National Post, David Warren, columnist for the Ottawa Citizen. Thanks to you all.
My pleasure.